This chapter is number 13, and it's on the peripheral nervous system and reflex activity. So, the peripheral nervous system is going to be everything that's outside of the central nervous system, which, as you know, would be everything outside the brain and the spinal cord. So I like to think of it as the wires that are going into the central nervous system, and then the wires that are coming out of the central nervous system. So some of the main structures that are included in this system first begin with the different receptors, then the transmission lines, which are essentially those wires that are going to carry that sensory information to the central nervous system. The central nervous system decides what to do with that information, and then it sends information away from it, the central nervous system, to the motor endings and motor activity. And that's where reflex activity can kind of occurs throughout the system. So at the end of this chapter, we'll be looking at reflexes. When we look at this diagram here, you first can see the sensory or the afferent division. This is where the receptors are going to be located at. So then the signal travels from the sensory division through the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system. And as you know, the central nervous system is the site of integration, where kind of the decisions are made. Once those decisions are made, then the efferent information is going to travel out through the peripheral nervous system to either the somatic nervous system, which is voluntary, or the autonomic nervous system, which is involuntary. And the two parts of the autonomic nervous system are shown here, the sympathetic division as well as the parasympathetic division. So some of those sensory receptors, they can all be classified in different ways based on the type of stimulus, the body location, or the structural complexity. So essentially what happens is this specialized receptor is going to respond to some sort of change in the environment, which is a stimulus, and that activation is going to result in a graded potential, which then triggers a nerve impulse. So there's awareness of the stimulus or sensation and interpretation of that stimulus called perception, which occurs in the brain. So the receptors classified by stimulus type are included on this slide. And you want to pay attention basically to the prefix. We have mechano, which would be a mechanical receptor, where it responds to touch, pressure, vibration, or stretch. Thermo, which has to do with change in temperature. A photoreceptor, and the example of the photoreceptor that we have is a complex one that responds to light energy, and that's the retina, which you'll be learning about in a later chapter. There's also called chemoreceptors, which responds to chemicals. These would include smell receptors, olfactory receptors, taste receptors, which are gustatory receptors, or other change in blood chemistry. For example, changes in pH that may occur in the blood. Another group is called a nociceptor, and this is a pain-causing stimulus that activates it. So this is the only exception of a receptor where the prefix doesn't really tell you exactly what it is. Now, when we classify these receptors by location, we have three different options. First of all, if the receptor's on the external surface of the body, where the stimulus is arising outside of the body, it's an exteroceptor. And these could be receptors in the skin for touch, pressure, pain, or temperature. So you can see that the location is different than the stimulus type. So again, there's three different characteristics to classify receptors. So the location could also be an interoceptor, which could also be called a visceroreceptor, which means visceral. So we're talking about a deep organ. And there's a stimulus in the internal viscera or blood vessels, sensitive to chemical changes, tissue stretch, temperature changes. And the last one is a proprioceptor. The proprioceptors are always going to be activated, meaning they're always sending afferent information to the brain from either skeletal muscles, tendons, joints, or ligaments about the movements occurring within those specific areas. So kind of think of them as sending information about joint activity. So if it's information coming from the knee joint, it sends information from those tendons, muscles, ligaments, everything in that area, which tells the brain whether that knee is contracted or it's relaxed. The last characteristic whereby we classify receptors is whether they are simple or complex. The simple receptors are going to be modified dendritic endings of sensory neurons, and they're found throughout the body, and they monitor most types of general sensory information. So the general sensory information would not be special senses. Special senses are going to be covered in chapter 15, and they house complex sense organs. Things like the eye for vision, the ear for hearing, the inner ear for equilibrium, smell for the olfactory receptors in the nose, and finally the gustatory receptors, which are the taste receptors. So we also then can classify receptors based on whether they are encapsulated or non-encapsulated. General receptors include tactile sensations, and no one receptor leads to one specific function. So there's a lot of overlap. So the receptors are either non-encapsulated, which means they don't have a connective tissue layer around them. If they're encapsulated, that means that they do. So non-encapsulated ones are going to be abundant in the epithelia and the connective tissues. Most of them are non-myelinated, so they don't have that the lipid surrounding the fibers to insulate them, so the signals travel slowly down the nerve. So we classify them as small diameter group C fibers. They respond mostly to temperature, pain, and light touch. So remember, thermoreceptors are temperature. They could be located in the superficial dermis, whereas nociceptors are pain receptors triggered by extreme temperature changes, pinch, release of various chemicals. And then finally, other non-encapsulated ones are ones that you've heard of in previous chapters. The tactile or the Merkel discs, which remember are in the deepest layer of the epidermis, and hair follicle receptors are free nerve endings that wrap around hair follicles. So an example of this is that they allow you to feel a mosquito landing on your skin.